Press Club, and welcome to today's talk on U.S.-Iran relations. My name is Ivan Sashashian, and I'm the director of the graduate program in negotiation and conflict management in the College of Public Affairs at the University of Baltimore. And it is my great privilege and my distinct honor to introduce our distinguished guest at today's luncheon, a man who needs no introduction, the Honorable Newt Gingrich.
Thank you very, very much. I really want to talk about the challenge of morality and reality in democratic societies, because I think it relates directly to the quandary we find ourselves in and to the difficulty we're having, for example, with the State Department. And I want to take two examples, Stanley Baldwin in the 1930s and Ronald Reagan in the early 1980s. If you go back and you look at the 1930s, it is as much the British news media as it is the British politicians who are determined to avoid reality. And in fact, as late as the early spring of 1940, after the war had been going on since September 1939, the British newspapers were advised by the government to not be too aggressive in describing the German people in a negative way, because they didn't want to make the hostility worse. This was before the collapse of France, before the bombing campaign, and so you had this whole mindset of, can't we find some way to accommodate the unaccommodatable? Can't we find some way to avoid facts that frighten us? Can't we find some way to pretend it will all work out? So you have this gap. Those who saw had no power, and those who had power were afraid to see. And I think if you look at the current situation with the Iranian dictatorship, you see almost exactly the same gap. But when I hear Ahmadinejad talk, I have a sense that he's quite sincere in his desire to use nuclear weapons. And I think my experience of history is, when dictators tell you they will do something, it is useful to believe them. It's not just bluster. It's not just... And we're in a period of total confusion in this city. Let me just give you the most recent example. This is a topic they were reminding me. If you go back and check my career, I have been around a long time. I mean, I first became concerned about the dictatorship in 1979 for fairly obvious reasons. I mean, any dictatorship which sponsors the violation of international law in order to hold Americans hostage for 440 days is probably a regime which, in fact, has enormous potential to become dangerous. In the 1980s, watching them in Lebanon, it was clear that they had become a very sophisticated exporter of terrorism. Now, there's nothing that has changed in the current dictatorship. It is a fanatic imposition on the people of Iran by a power structure determined to create a future radically unacceptable to the United States. And we ought to be... So the reality part of this ought to be pretty straightforward. These are people who are not going to change. They didn't seize power over 30 years ago in order to be negotiated with by our State Department and give up their identity. And so you have to start with, what are the negotiations going to be like? They will be drawn out. They will be dishonest. They will involve all sorts of placating comments as long as they have no meaning. But the idea that we are somehow going... And there are two problems with the current strategy. One, that we think they're going to give in. And two, that we think you can indirectly threaten them enough to get them to change their fundamental nature. I don't believe that's going to happen. So one future is, we keep playing diplomatic games. They keep lying to us. One morning they have nuclear weapons. And I think there's a very real danger they'll use them. There's also a very real danger that they'll just lose one or two. So one totally unacceptable future should be an Iranian nuclear weapon. This dictatorship, I mean, we've lived with a number of countries having nuclear weapons. We haven't had a country which was an aggressively determined country that publicly says it wants to use them, yet nuclear weapons. Faced with a dictatorship which is a threat to us, what do? We isolate the most effective ally we had in the Iranian people and decide they are unacceptable. And it's really, I mean, this is not new. I've talked about this I gave a speech on this in 2002 at the American Enterprise Institute and said we needed a fundamental, thorough overhaul of the culture of the Foreign Service. Because this makes no sense at all. An America that understood how dangerous the dictatorship is would be actively working with the MEK and would be actively, candidly working with every possible group that showed up. Now, the idea that we could not design a strategy against a dictatorship in Tehran, a dictatorship which can't deliver economically, oppresses its people, based on everything I've seen, has lost the overwhelming majority of people under 40, now want change. And the fact that we can't come together and say we should all be on the same side makes no sense at all. And this is why I think on a bipartisan basis, you now see 90 people in the House sponsoring a resolution to recognize that the MEK is in fact an ally of ours against a regime that we cannot tolerate. And I think it's why you've also seen in the Senate, for example, the chairman of the Armed Services Committee, the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee speaking out. I mean, these are both Democrats. This policy has been going on now for 3 administrations, starting with Clinton and continuing through George W. Bush into Obama. So it is an institutional policy of the State Department. And I believe that it makes no sense at all. And trying to understand what we could do next. I have 2 specific suggestions. So the people in the United States understand how many American ties. It's very important that you humanize the story and don't just let it remain a political story. The second point I'd make is, and this goes to the whole naivete of where we are in dealing, frankly, both with radical Islamism and dealing with the dictatorship in Iran. We really need to understand, we need to have much more public information, much more methodical information about the level of the disinformation campaign that the Iranian dictatorship is running. I mean, when I see certain articles and I see certain people quoted, this is why we need help, but I'm virtually convinced that they are things that were planted by the dictatorship. And I think that we are very to allow ourselves to be manipulated by our enemies on the scale that we are. All I can report in closing is we have a dictatorship which in its mind has been at war with us since 1979. And we keep trying to find some way to be nice to them while they figure out new ways to be at war with us. And I think we need to find a way to educate the American people that there is an absolute congruence between morality and reality, and that we need a policy which has the right intensity, the right focus, which unifies every element of Iranian society which is opposed to the dictatorship, and which has the active support of the United States for replacing the regime, not for negotiating with it.